In this video, I'm going to explain how a rent-to-own works. And in order to do that, I got to go over sort of a normal buying process and so that you can see how it's different with a rent-to-own. So if somebody's just buying a house, and we'll go through an example here. Let's assume they're buying a house for $200,000. And here's their house. Obviously, you probably wouldn't pay $200,000 for that place. 200, and they have $20,000 to put down, which means they're actually short $180,000. Now, this is not normally a big deal because they go to a bank or a credit union or a mortgage company, and they would apply for the $180,000 loan. Now, and then so if they would go to a bank, let's say they go to a bank, the bank approves them, gives them the money, and then the homeowner, obviously, their ultimate goal is to get the $200,000 because they want to move on with they want their money. So a rent-to-own, I'll explain how this is different, is you're not actually buying the property right away. You have the option to buy the house. You are purchasing an option to buy, but you're not actually purchasing the house. So there's some pros and cons to this and some risks, and I'm going to cover some of them in this. So let's pretend exact same scenario, except in this scenario, so 200,000. Oops, 200,000. They have, in this case, they have less money to put down. I've found my experience has been that people going into rent-to-owns usually don't have as much of a deposit. So they're short $195,000. So they can't make this work. And I'll cover in another video. I'll cover the type of clients that would actually be a good fit for rent-to-own, which ones wouldn't be. But in this one, I'll actually just explain the process. So what happens is the homeowner says, you know what, I don't need my money right away. I'd like to sell this place, but I don't need it now, so I'll work out a deal with you. And I'll give you an example of how this would work. So they'll say, okay, you can buy my house for $200,000. I'm going to take $5,000 from you now. This money is not refundable. That's very important. That money, once you've entered into this contract, you can't get it back. And then they're going to say, we're going to go into a 20, and this is all negotiable, and it's different on pretty much every one of them. So let's say they're going to do 24 months, and they're going to want rent of $1,250 a month. Plus, they're going to say, we want another $250 in option money. And option money is essentially money that's going towards your down payment. So $250 times 24 works out to be $6,000. That means that the person in the rent-to-own contract will have put down $5,000 here and $6,000 total. So for a total of $11,000. So there's their monthly money and monthly. I missed the letter, and then there's their deposit. So this is $5,000. So a total of $11,000. Now, a couple things about this. They are locking in. They typically lock in a price up front. So if the property value is worth more, the tenant wins. If the property is worth less, that can be a risk for the tenant. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they do not have the obligation to buy. They have the option. So, for instance, let's say the homeowner, the person, if this is the buyer, the tenant who is going to go into the property, and if he decides to move because he's got a different job offer, then you would lose your money. So that's something you have to really weigh when you're going into a rent-to-own, is that you're committing to the house and the property in the area as much as is within your power. And it's more expensive than a typical rental, but you also get there's a few more things about it as well. So for instance, typically as a rent-to-own tenant, you would also be responsible for some of the upkeep of the property. So they usually set a limit. So if there's any repairs that are, and this is an example, this isn't the only way to do it. If there's repairs under $500, so they'd say in the contract, anything under $500 you have to pay. If it's over, we work out a deal on it, because the person doing the rent-to-own wants a sort of a low maintenance tenant and they want somebody who's responsible that will be an owner. So there are a couple of differences with just regular renting. Now, and when regular renting, obviously you don't get any of your rent money back. So I'll show you another example of how it can be done. And this one is a little bit more expensive, but it can be good for some people. And I'll show you how this one works. So let's assume exact same scenario, $200,000, and the tenant has $5,000, and the homeowner says, no way, no how, I do not want to do a rent to own. I need my money. I'm taking my money and I'm buying another place, I'm moving, whatever the case may be. So the buyer has, and in this case, if this is the buyer, they would approach an investor. And the investor, so he would go to him, he would buy the house for $200,000 or whatever they negotiate. So he would say, fine, I will buy the house and I will do a rent-to-own agreement with you. So with this rent-to-own agreement, this one will be more expensive for the buyer because obviously the investor has to, the homeowner wanted $200,000, the investor's going to want more because they're tying up their money in their credit. So let's look at how one of these could look. So let's say they're going to put down $5,000 as a deposit. Typically what happens is, and they say they want a 24-month term. 24. So typically what happens is if the investor pays $200 for the property, they'll factor in their costs and they'll come back and say, okay, I'll do this for you, but I'm going to charge you 4% or 5% a year. So what does that mean? It means that they take the $200,000 and they add 4% to it. So in the first year, it would be $208. And in the second year, it would be a little bit more than that because it's compounded. So it would be $208,000 year one, year two, just 1 second, 208, 123 times 1.04, 216,320. So 216,320 will be year two. So the buyer now, instead of getting the house for $200, they would end up paying more money. Now, let's say that all the other terms remain the same. They pay $1,250 a month. They pay $250 in option money, so that at the end of the term they would again have the $11,000. The money is still non-refundable. They still have the option, but not the obligation to buy the property if they decide they change their mind or for whatever reason they don't want the property. They would lose their deposit money. And so in this scenario, as you can see, the risks for the buyer are the property value goes down, in which case they may regret that they went into it. The risks for the investor are the buyer does not exercise. So they bought a house with the intention of being able to sell it and make a profit, but if the buyer doesn't complete, then there's no, they potentially could lose their profit. So there is more risk in this one, and this one here you definitely want to do your homework on to make sure that it makes sense. But if you have questions on rent to owns, I am happy to answer them. My email is scott@scottpeckford.ca.